Welcome to the podcast of the Global Mobility Project at Ohio State University. Our project integrates the insights of the arts, humanities, and social sciences to facilitate a conversation of how local culture and individual decision-making inform and reflect the complex global forces behind mobility. During 2016-2017 academic year, we will be hosting a lecture series on the topic Immigrants and Refugees, Comparative Experiences. Today's speaker is Professor Ulf Brunnbauer, Professor of History and Director of the Center for East European and Southeast European Studies in Regensburg, Germany. At Ohio State, he is giving a talk entitled On the Other Side of the Migration Debate, Controlling Emigration in 20th Century Southeastern Europe. Good morning.
Good morning, Theodora.
A world without borders seemed certain with the end of the Cold War. Yet today, there are more than 65 million refugees and 255 million migrants worldwide, and immigration is emerging as an important public dilemma throughout the world. What is the role of the humanities and arts in addressing this global challenge?
Well, let's maybe start with the numbers that you just mentioned to highlight what the role of the humanities and arts can be in the debate about immigration and emigration. First of all, I think our publics tend to believe that we are now globally experiencing a wave of migration without precedent. But actually that's not true. One probably could argue that in terms of numbers, the dimension of migration did not change so much for the last centuries. Mobility and migration was always there. It is part of how societies are organized. It is part of what humans do in the past and today. So I think one thing that especially history could provide is a more long-term perspective, and to decrease a little bit the hysteria, the public hysteria, which is articulated when migration is debated. A second thing that the humanities can contribute is actually to remember what are the strengths of humanities. And one of their particularities is that they typically pursue an humanistic approach. So they're about to understand how other people think, what is actually the meanings that they give to their actions and to the world in which they live. So arts and humanities can do something to better understand not only migrants, but also how societies and how different groups who interact with migrants perceive migration, what kind of meaning they make out of migration. Also to understand whether there are the anxieties and the fears that very often are related to migration. Thirdly, I think humanities are perfectly suited to provide context, to highlight that migration cannot be considered in isolation from other important social, economic and cultural processes, and that we have to relate it to these other structures and also political, cultural, social practices in order to arrive at a more holistic understanding of migration.
Thank you for this reminder that structures and contexts are important. There are complex reasons why people move, from war and violence to economic insecurity to environmental change. Based on your research, why do people leave home?
Obviously, there are some occasions when you really need to leave home because the alternative would be next to certain death, forced migration to take refuge from war and political persecution and so on. If we talk about voluntary or so-called voluntary migration, which per se is also a little bit a problematic concept, then it's obviously that people consider migration as one of the few options they have to improve their own lot and the lot of their family. Basically, the migration mainly comes down to a family decision. It is taken within a family context, and the ultimate goal of most migrants, of most economic migrants, is to improve the livelihood of their family. Maybe we should also problematize a little bit the understanding of migration. There are certain forms of human mobility which we don't problematize, which we don't consider migration because they don't involve the crossing of a state border. And I think this is also a little bit problematic, and it also shows that the very concept of migration as a specific form of human movement across a state border is the result of certain bureaucratic practices. Because from the point of view of humans who are moving from one place to another in order to improve their lives, in order to earn more, in order to better opportunities for their offspring, it might not make so much of a difference whether this movement crosses a state border or not. I mean, in countries like the US or also in the European Union, you can move to pretty different cultural settings and over long distances, but you're still within the same political realm, and therefore it is not considered officially not considered migration, whereas you can move a very short distance, but once you cross the border, it is considered migration, and then it is considered a problem. And I think we really need to problematize this differentiation between mobility and migration.
Thank you so much. So the influx of refugees and immigrants in Europe and the United States in particular has caused much debate in recent years. However, if we look closely at the numbers, we will notice that the biggest number of movers is actually outside of the West. Based on your work, how do communities accept newcomers?
I think the first thing that we need to stress is that most refugees are seeking refuge outside of Europe or the United States. So it's really a very small share of the worldwide refugee movement that arrives in Europe, which also should make us think about what we understand as global solidarity. I mean, judging from the historical perspective, as far as migrant integration is concerned, I think that local communities prove to be very resilient and in the long term also very inclusive. And the question then is whether the political framework is organized in a way to facilitate inclusion. Inclusion is always something that is done on the community, on the local level, and the state or the political framework, the government, can take some measures to facilitate inclusion or to make it more difficult. If they decide for the latter, then all sides in this complex relationship, both the local communities and the migrants, will suffer. And I think what we can learn from the historical experience, that the best way to facilitate integration or inclusion is to open up a relatively fast and straightforward way to citizenship, and to make migrants stakeholders in the society to which they have moved, to give them a say, to make them part of the political body of a country, because only then a government will really begin to take their concerns serious as well. Once they have a vote, then they are taken much more seriously than if they are considered foreigners without a vote.
Thank you so much for this insightful conversation.
Thank you.